What's up, everybody? How's it going? I can't believe it's already our last week of our Questions and Answers 2.0 series. It's been a good one. I've loved the 2 weeks before, and this week's going to be another good one, but it is kind of sad to see another one go. I'm already looking forward to next year's 3.0 series, or maybe we'll do something like Questions and Answers 3000. I've got some ideas. But we're going to finish it up. I've got some questions left, and again, let's get right to it. Oh, wow. There's actually only 2 questions left for this week. I guess let's make them count. This one says, Jeff, I'm going to be honest, I really miss your vlog. That had to be some of the most beautiful cinematography I have ever seen in my entire life. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I was just wondering if you would be kind enough to bring back one of my favorite segments, the Revision Staff Food Review. Again, I miss the entire vlog, but if you could even just give us a taste of what once was, I'd really, really appreciate it. Guess we only have one option. What's up, everyone? Welcome to another Revision Staff Food Review. What are you going with?
I'm going with blueberry pancake.
That's what I was gonna go with.
Getting root beer float ice cream.
That's what I was going to go with, too. Today we're doing ice cream because we've learned our lesson from months and months of doing terrible foods. We figured it's time to do delicious foods. So we came downtown. What's this place called?
Black Cat ice cream.
Black Cat. Run right out of this building. That's super good. They make ice cream in Tupperware containers.
Yeah, that's when you know it's legit, when they're grabbing it out of like your grandma's plastic Tupperware box.
So what flavor? We all got super awesome different flavors.
Sort of. Well,
We got two different flavors.
We got root beer float.
Because it's the best, probably. What'd you
second,
guys get?
second best to blueberry pancake.
I'm actually kind of jealous of that one.
That sounds
really good.
There are not only blueberries, there are chunks of pancake.
That's
Really?
Like somebody
so
made
good.
pancakes
I'm
and cut them
kind
up
of regretting my
and
decision.
threw them into this ice cream. They taste pancakey.
Clearly, we've already been munching on
We're
it,
not going to sit here and let it melt.
Yeah, that'd be ridiculous.
so you're not going to get the, really super excited response that you would normally get from Revision Staff Food Review.
Yeah, usually we're just bubbling with excitement.
Yeah.
But should we just do a ceremonial first bite anyways?
Oh, yeah.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Clink. Spilled on your shirt, Jeff.
That's all right.
Oh, that's shockingly good.
Wow.
I'm surprised by how good that first bite was.
This is quite delicious. Tastes basically like a root beer float. I will say, like, on an ice cream scale, it's very good ice cream, but I can't say that it's the best ice cream. Kiana and I were in Nashville, and there was a place there that was fantastic. And I would not be able to put this quite on that scale. But it's still very tasty. Probably for Des Moines. At least downtown Des Moines, it's got to be the best, because there's like no ice cream places in there.
It's no Nashville.
I don't know, I'm not even a huge ice cream fan. Like, compared to a lot of people. It's just not my top choice of dessert. But I would eat this again repeatedly. I don't hate ice cream, I just don't love it. But this is really quite good.
I love ice cream, and the worst part about this is how tiny the spoon is. I want one of those giant
For the sake of
spoons
the
that they
review, do
hang
you
on
want to
the wall.
swap
But
bites
it feels fancy
and
'cause it's all-
test?
Yeah.
Is that- We're testing each other's.
I thought you were going to do the thing where you wrap your arms around.
That does taste like a root beer float.
I mean, it's like exactly what a root beer float
Yeah,
is.
that's
Which
really
is maybe
good.
why I'm not quite as impressed, because like a root beer float I've
Yeah,
had a lot. That is very, very tasty.
this is super good. I like the blueberry a little better, but that's very good.
I would agree that I think I like the
That's
blueberry.
better.
Yeah. Wishing I would have gotten the blueberry.
Alright, well, what would you give your ice cream?
I forgot my scale.
You're
Oh,
a
hey.
letter grade.
Oh, this is an A. On an all food scale, it's an A. On an ice cream scale, it's an A. This is just good.
Grant, what's your
I'll give it a A-. Still pretty good.
You're
But
at
I-
7 stars.
Oh shoot! 6.25 stars. Room for a few other ice cream places that I think are better, but it's very good ice cream.
That's a B+. You need a 6.3 for an A-. Can you bump it up 500ths of a point?
That was pretty close, Mike.
No, I'm just asking. For the sake of the subscribers.
No,
Both
because
of
you.
them. This is a 5-star ice cream. There's probably better, like Grant said, but that doesn't take away from the deliciousness that's in my hands right now. Courtney,
It's
2
getting
thumbs up.
a bit
I
soggy.
agree.
why don't we sing 'em?
There's probably other ones that are just as good, but this is amazing. Really, really good.
So now for the next 5 minutes, you can just watch us eat. Well, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time you guys beg me for another food review. See you then.
Hit him with a high five.
Pound it. Noggin.
Noggin.
See ya! Alright, and the last question for Questions and Answers 2.0, it says this. Can I trust the Bible? How do I know that the Bible is accurate and then I can believe what it says? Can I trust the Bible? That's a really good question. I had an idea. I thought instead of me sitting here and having you listen to me again, there's someone else I have in mind who would be really good at answering this question. So here we go.
So Jeff summoned me to be the guest videoist. What do you call it? Speaker. For the question of can I trust the Bible? And it's a good question to ask. We've all heard objections to the idea that the Bible's trustworthy, and if you haven't, you will at some point. People are going to come along and tell you that the Bible's just a bunch of made-up legends, that Jesus maybe was a great guy, maybe was a great teacher, but none of that stuff could really have actually historically happened, could it have? And anyways, the Bible was written by people in power, so that they could keep their power, and it's outdated, it's ancient, it's thousands of years old, it's just not reliable. And the question is, what holds up? Like intellectually, if we're really gonna come to this and think well about whether the Bible is or is not trustworthy, what holds up to criticism? What does the evidence bear out? Does it bear out this idea that it's just a bunch of fairy tales and legends? Or does it bear out the idea that the Bible is a trustworthy book? And it matters to ask that question. And I think the question hinges on 3 different questions, actually. The first is the Bible textually reliable? That is what we have actually what was written down, and was it really written by the people that it says it was written by? And 2, is it historically reliable? Did this stuff actually happen, or did it not? Is it just made up? And the third one is it culturally reliable? It's thousands of years old. Does it have anything to say to the lives we're living today? And I want to really briefly talk about all 3 of those questions. The first one is the Bible textually reliable? There's this entire genre of scholarship about that. It's called text criticism, and there are literary critics, geniuses all over the world at universities who spend their entire lives and careers critiquing ancient literary works to find out if they're textually reliable. And they ask 2 basic questions: who wrote it, and is this what they actually wrote? Because in ancient books, there are a lot of times where they were written pseudonymously, which is to say that they were written and somebody wrote a different name on it. Kind of like, I don't want to ruin your childhood, but kind of like Dr. Seuss. He was not actually a doctor, and his name isn't even Seuss. He was a guy named Theodore Geisel who wrote Dr. Seuss on all of his books. And way back in the day, you couldn't like Google somebody or fact check them on Twitter right away and be like, this does not look like your profile picture. You did not write this. And so people would attach famous people's names to stuff that they wrote to make people read it and think it was important. And so, we have these historians, Herodotus and Seneca and Josephus, and people would write their names on different stuff so that people would actually read it. And so literary critics look back and say, did this person actually write this book, or did they not? And then the second question they ask is this what they actually wrote? Like, if they can determine that this is the person who actually wrote it, is this the stuff that they wrote? Because that question has to be asked for anything written before 1440, of course, because what happened in 1440? Candy bar to the person who shouted out, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. He did. And in 1440, we could begin carbon copying stuff. But before that, it had to be copied by hand. And as scribes over the years and centuries wrote stuff down, they kind of took out stuff they didn't like or didn't agree with, and they added stuff as they wanted, and they made mistakes and errors. And so we have all kinds of ancient books written by Plato and Aristotle and Livy and Tacitus and Herodotus and Caesar and Homer. And as text critics look back at them, what they realized is that the New Testament is in a league of its own. All those ancient writers, there are so few copies of what they actually wrote, and those copies span so many centuries, and those copies are so different from each other. We don't even know what the original one said. Like, they asked 3 questions. How many copies do we have? How ancient are they? Or how old are they? Because older ones are more reliable. And how closely do they relate? And of all the books in the history of ancient literature, only Homer's Iliad comes anywhere near the New Testament. It has 400 and some copies. They're 95% the same. The New Testament is 99.5% accurate across over 14,000 copies, and most of that 1/2 of 1% are spelling errors or just missed words. It's shockingly accurate, and the Old Testament is even crazier. The Old Testament text that we take out of Hebrew and translate into English today is based off of some Old Testament texts written down by this group of Jews called the Masoretes in the 600s to 900s AD. And we thought, hey, that's probably pretty close. We know that they copied it really carefully, that if they made a mistake in ancient times, they would throw the entire page away and start over. And we thought the Masoretes were probably pretty close. And then in 1943, a group of Bedouin shepherds discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had been written thousands of years BC. And they were preserved because of the unique environmental conditions by the Dead Sea. And we opened them up and found that the 600 to 900s AD text of the Masoretes matched up almost exactly with the Old Testament words that had been written down thousands and thousands of years earlier. Is the Bible textually reliable? There is not another book like it in the history of the world. So many books are written by like one guy. We have a few copies and they're all different from each other. This is over 30 different authors spread out over multiple millennia that contain one message, the self-revelation of a God who tells the same story, weaved through the thread of multiple authors over thousands of years. And what we have today is almost exactly what was written thousands of years ago. It's the most textually reliable book in the history of the world. There's nothing like it. But is it historically reliable? Okay, this is actually written by the guys who said they wrote it, but did it actually happen, or are they just making up fiction? Is it just a bunch of fairy tales? And this is where, in the 20th century, the atheists thought they could win. They thought, because of advancements in science, because of advancements in education, we can now go back and archaeologically, historically prove that this stuff didn't actually happen. The Bible's just full of made-up stories. And so they launched this campaign in the 1960s and 70s called the Search for the Historical Jesus. Because Jesus couldn't have actually healed people. He couldn't have actually done miracles. He certainly wasn't born of a virgin. And he absolutely couldn't die and rise again. We know that dead people don't live. And so they went on a search for like what Jesus actually did. And they're like, all right, we're going to get him now. We're going to find the historical Jesus. But what they actually found was the biblical Jesus, and the whole movement just really blew up in their face because all they kept finding was truths that lined up with what the Bible said about who Jesus really was, and they failed massively to disprove one single thing the Bible said about him. And a leading atheist scholar in the 1990s was a lady named Anne Rice, and eventually, after trafficking in those circles and going on the search for the historical Jesus, she wrote, "The entire case was not made," and she became a Christian. C.S. Lewis, even earlier, is one of the foremost literary critics of the 20th century. Just brilliant, beyond brilliant, beyond brilliant. He critiqued ancient books for a living, and he was the best that ever lived at it. He said this: "A young atheist cannot be too careful about what he reads, Because Lewis started reading the Bible and he started reading these atheist books, and what he found was that it's the most historically reliable document in the history of the world, and it makes more logical sense to believe that this stuff actually happened than to try to prove it doesn't. And Lewis too became a Christian. He did that based on two factors, specifically for C.S. Lewis. The first was historically fulfilled prophecy, and the second was the timing, content, and form of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these accounts of Jesus' life. Historically fulfilled prophecy. We can look back at stories, at prophecies that the Old Testament wrote down hundreds, even thousands of years before they happened, and watch them come true. There's one specifically in Ezekiel chapter 26. He writes about this city of Tyre in Sidon, this ancient empire that was very strong but very rebellious. And Ezekiel in chapter 26 writes down 7 specific things that are going to happen to the city of Tyre. He writes that Nebuchadnezzar would conquer the city, that other nations would help fulfill the prophecy, that Tyre would be flattened to the ground, that Tyre's stone and woods would be cast into the sea, that Tyre would become a flat rock where fishermen would spread their nets, that other cities would have great fear because of the fall of Tyre, and that the old city of Tyre would never be rebuilt. It's a pretty powerful prophecy. Hundreds and hundreds of years later, in 585 BC, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city of Tyre for over a decade. In 537, he broke down the gates, only to find the people had moved everything to a fortified island half a mile offshore. So he laid waste to the mainland city and flattened it. But the fortified island kind of remained, so it looked like, oh, well, Ezekiel might be wrong. Ezekiel 26 might not happen. And then 250 years later, a 22-year-old general named Alexander drove his army east. He was marching towards Egypt. He arrived in Phoenicia. He demanded that the city of Tyre surrender to him. They decided, forget you. We can't be beat. We're out here on an island. There's nothing you can do. And Alexander didn't have a navy with him, and so what he did was call a whole bunch of other nations to help him, and their navy surrounded the island city of Tyre. Then Alexander took the ruins that Nebuchadnezzar had left, and he threw them all into the sea, and he made a land bridge that you can still see from space today out to that island. He laid siege to them. He conquered them. Every last one of them got wiped out, and the city of Tyre has still never been rebuilt today. Fishermen in the Mediterranean use the old city of Tyre as a place to dry their nets. Now, Christian and secular scholars estimate that the likelihood over hundreds of years of all 7 of those things actually happening is about 1 in 400 million. But they happened. And even Jesus, if you take 7 of the major birth prophecies of the hundreds that are given in the Old Testament about him, you throw out the virgin birth, that's an impossibility. You throw out some of the ones that just couldn't have happened. The likelihood of like the 7 major ones, like Jesus is going to be born in Bethlehem, you throw out, or you take 7 of the major ones, again, scientists have estimated that it's a virtual impossibility. The likelihood that Jesus could have even fulfilled 7 of the hundreds of prophecies in the Old Testament that he fulfilled is the same likelihood as if I took a quarter, I put an X on it, I filled the entire state of Iowa 8 feet deep, I drove Jeff around blindfolded in a helicopter, and at one point he just decided to dive out, blindfolded, into this 8 feet of quarters. He pulled out 1, and it was the 1 with an X on it. It's impossible, but it happened. It happened. And then the second thing that Lewis decided is so historically reliable about the Bible is the timing, the content, and the form of the Gospels. The timing is this. Like, people who disagree with the Bible, people say it isn't reliable, want to argue that it was written like hundreds of years later by guys in power, right? But Lewis took a look at the Gospel and said that's impossible. Number one, it doesn't claim to be. There are names in there. Like, in the Gospel of Mark, it's like, Alexander and Rufus, their dad did it. Their dad carried Jesus' cross, and basically he's saying, go ask them, they're still alive. I'm writing this down. I saw it happen. You want to see if it's true? Go ask Alex. Go ask Rufus. They're literally right over there. You know them. Go ask them. And so the timing of the Gospels, they're so early. They happened while eyewitnesses are still alive. They were written in an era where if it wasn't true, a whole bunch of people living in Jerusalem could have said, nuh-uh, Jesus did not live. I was here. Except for that's not what people said. Instead, people in mass converted to the church, gave their lives to Jesus because they saw what happened. And then the content of the Gospels, the stuff that it writes down, is just, Lewis again argued, and so many others have argued this too, if the Gospels were written by people in power to maintain power, they would have been written entirely differently than they are. Jesus would not be the Jesus we get in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if this is written to like keep power, if this is written by human people. Because Jesus, like, let's be honest, he's a real pain in the butt in the Gospels. Like, if I wrote Jesus, if I was making up a story, he would not have told me to get rid of all my possessions and give everything to the poor and serve. And he would not have said, hey, you're going to have to suffer for my name. All the disciples had to die for this. Like, they gave up their lives for it. And Jesus said really difficult, hard stuff. Why would they write Jesus so difficult? Well, Jesus wouldn't have been the Jesus we get if that wasn't the Jesus who was there. And he wouldn't, and the disciples wouldn't have been idiots. Like, these guys who are allegedly writing the book to keep themselves in power wrote themselves as the morons of the story, not the heroes of the story. If people wanted like everyone to follow Peter, who was the head of the early church, they would not have made Peter the biggest idiot in the New Testament. But Peter is clearly the biggest idiot in the New Testament, and also the hero dies. Jesus died. And that makes more sense to us 2,000 years later because we've been influenced by Jesus. But back then, power is what was worshipped. No one was going to worship a dead God, but Jesus, the hero, died. We would not have the Jesus that we have unless the stuff actually happened in the form of them even is massively different than ancient fiction. It makes a little bit of sense to us because we have realistic fiction. It tries to evoke a sense of realism, like, we can smell the apple pie and it reminds me of my mom. That's not how ancient books are written. Even books written hundreds of years after the Bible, like Beowulf, contain nothing about, like, no details about, like, the dew on the grass. That's not how they work. They only write details that advance the plot forward. And yet in Mark 5, Jesus is sleeping on a pillow. In John 21, in John 8, Jesus is like, he's writing in the dust. There's all these details that are in there because these guys saw it and they wrote down what happened. And C.S. Lewis, he took a look at this, and as a literary critic, he wrote this: I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, and myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know none of them are like this. Of this gospel text, there are only two possible views. Either it is stories reported by those who saw them, or else some unknown ancient writer, without known predecessors or known successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic realistic narrative. Are the stories, is the Bible historically reliable? There's not another book like it in the history of the world. Nothing comes close to the historical reliability of this book. And the last question is it culturally reliable? And admittedly, this is one where a lot of people get hung up because they look at the Bible and they read things about, like, slavery. And Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. And rightly, like, our stomachs churn at the idea of that. We have a real problem with that because we read slavery through the lens of our understanding of American chattel slavery. And sometimes we struggle with it culturally because we misinterpret what it's really talking about. Like, slavery in ancient Roman times didn't mean that someone owned you and beat you. It just meant that they owned your labor. Basically, you got paid for it and you were free to go and do what you wanted. You just couldn't switch jobs. If you were going to work, you had to work for that person for a period of about 10 to 15 years before you could buy your freedom and do something different. And so sometimes it's problematic for us culturally because we don't understand what it's talking about. We're divorced from the world of the Bible. And sometimes it's problematic culturally for us because it's problematic culturally. It says things that make us uncomfortable. It says things that we don't like. It says things that challenge us. And I would argue that that's exactly what makes it culturally reliable. That if you have a book that can't challenge you, if it can only say what you want it to say, if it can't make you uncomfortable, then you have a God who can't challenge you, and that makes you God and not God God. God is only God if he can challenge you. God is only God if he is the source of truth and you are not. And so the fact that the Bible sometimes challenges us and sometimes invites us to think long and hard about how and where we need to change is what makes it culturally reliable 3,000 years later. Yes, it's thousands of years old. And yes, sometimes it's challenging in a modern world. But if it wasn't, then it wouldn't be the self-revelation of God. If it wasn't, it would just be mankind writing down a book that makes us feel better about ourselves. So is the Bible reliable? it is unlike any other book in the history of the world. It's textually reliable, it's historically reliable, it's culturally reliable. There's nothing else like it. It makes a ton of logical sense to read this. The one thing I cannot prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt, I can tell you with absolute confidence on an intellectual, scholarly level, it is the most reliable book that's ever been written. There's nothing else like it. I can't tell you whether or not you should believe that it's all true. I can tell you whether you should. I can't tell you whether you will, but I can say this, like, the Bible is so reliable that you need to read it. If you want to take your life seriously, if you want to take the fact that your life is temporary and someday you're going to die seriously, then you have to decide whether this book is true or not. Whether this God is real and whether everything that it claims about who Jesus is, that the God of the universe stepped into human history and gave his life and rose again to defeat death so that you could be forgiven and set free and you could live. You have to decide whether that's true. And because that happened, because all of this history happened, we can look back and we can read this book as a reliable source of truth. We don't believe that this stuff happened as Christians because the Bible says so. We believe the Bible is true and reliable because we know this stuff happened. So is it reliable? Absolutely. There's not another book like it in the history of the world. And my invitation to you, my challenge to you is to crack it open and read it. It makes all kinds of intellectual sense on every level to read this book and trust that it's reliable, and you need to decide. You need to decide for your sake so that you can live out your creative purpose in the world, so you can be who God called you to be. You need to decide, because life is temporary and it's going to end someday, whether or not you believe it's true. And whether or not you're going to give all of yourself and the entirety of your future to this God who loved you enough to come and die for you. So my challenge is read it and let God speak into your life through it. Let the Spirit move in your heart through it to decide whether or not it's true. And if it is, give your entire life to it. But it absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is the most reliable, most unique book in the history of the world.